Welcome everyone, finally, thank you for your patience. Welcome everyone to the inaugural Miles Lewis Oration to be presented by Professor Alex Bremner. My name is Philip Goad and I'm Chair of Architecture and a co-director of ACAHUCH, the Australian Centre for Architectural History, Urban and Cultural Heritage here in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne. I begin today's proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, which may be multiple lands given the virtual locations of many of our audience. I'm currently speaking from Wurundjeri land, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and the place of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. Tonight's oration has been made possible by the Miles Lewis Fellowship, which is funded principally by the Vera Moore Foundation. And on behalf of the faculty and my ACAHUCH co-directors, our Dean, Professor Julie Willis and Professor Hannah Louie, both of whom are listening in virtually due to COVID protocols, I'm afraid, I would like to publicly acknowledge the support of the Foundation's trustees, Ian Morrison, Roger Blythman and David Richardson. The purpose of the Miles Lewis Fellowship is to advance the study of architectural history in Australia, and it's named in honour of Professor Emeritus Miles Lewis AM, who is here with us today. For many of us, Professor Lewis needs no introduction. He has been for more than 50 years one of Australia's most distinguished architectural historians and an internationally acknowledged champion of conservation practice and policy. He taught here in this institution for more than 35 years. The author of numerous books, reports and papers on architectural and construction history, heritage and conservation, Professor Lewis was an instrumental figure in the drafting of the Borough Charter, the AGA Principles in 1991, and the International Charter on Vernacular Architecture in 1999. He also shows no sign of stopping. One of his current projects, along with others, is to build the case nationally for a UNESCO World Heritage nomination for Australia's unique collection of 19th century portable buildings. The faculty and ACAHUCH is thus extremely pleased to be able to host and facilitate the Miles Lewis Fellowship. And also our speaker, of course, this evening, the inaugural Miles Lewis Fellow. So our fellow, Alex Bremner, is Professor of Architectural History at the University of Edinburgh. He specialises in the history and theory of 19th and early 20th century British architecture, including British imperial colonial architecture, architecture and energy in the context of climate change, and the spatial networks of commodity exchange in the Asia-Pacific region. His books include the multi-award-winning Imperial Gothic, Religious Architecture and High Anglican Culture in the British Empire, 1840 to 1870. And also the edited volume Architecture and Urbanism in the British Empire of 2016. He's currently completing a new study entitled Building Greater Britain, Architecture, Imperialism and the Edwardian Baroque Revival, 1885 to 1920, to be published by the Paul Mellon Centre and Yale University Press later this year. The title of the inaugural Miles Lewis Oration to be given by Professor Bremner is Back to the Future, Architecture and the Geopolitics of Communications Technology in the Edwardian Era. Please welcome Professor Alex Bremner.
Thank you very much, Philip, for that very generous introduction. As I don't have a microphone, I'm going to try and project my voice, but if at any point you cannot hear me, just raise a hand and let me know so I can speak up a bit more. For my part, first of all, I'd like to thank, of course, my friends in the Australian Centre for Architectural History, Urban and Cultural Heritage here in the Melbourne School of Design for inviting me and making me their inaugural Miles Lewis Fellow. It has been, as you can imagine, a long time in the making. COVID has put the skids under it numerous times. I was meant to be here initially in 2020, but it's now 2022, but better late than never. And all the better to be here in person, which is really wonderful indeed. I would also, as Philip has, like to thank the Vera Moore Foundation who support the fellowship financially, and of course Miles himself, who's sitting happily over there. I have developed a friendship with Miles and his wife, Mary, over the years. So it is a particular honour to be able to take up a fellowship in his name. For me, in that respect, it has extra or special meaning. And also to Theo, who I can't see here, he's disappeared, who has worked, I think, tirelessly to organise this event and also the logistics around my presence here in Melbourne. I should also mention the Leverhulme Trust, which you can see on the bottom right of the screen here in the UK, who were extremely generous in funding the research behind this talk and the larger project that it is a part of. I am very happy to say, and by way of a little self-promotion, which I'm sure you'll allow me, and Philip's already mentioned it anyway, the results of this bigger project are to be published imminently as a book. This should be out. Yep. Yes, it's working. Good, perfect. So here it is, this book entitled Greater Britain, Architecture, Imperialism and the Edwardian Baroque Revival, circa 1885 to 1920, to be published by the Paul Mellon Centre with Yale University Press in November of this year. And I know you're going to be as happy as I was with the image on the front cover here, which is a building we all know and love right here in Melbourne, Flinders Street Station. I have to say I did not choose the image for the cover. It was chosen for me by the publisher, but I did not argue when I was presented with this cover. It's great. So what you're going to hear this evening is a snippet really of this bigger enterprise from this book. So in fact, if you're looking at the contents page of this future book, it really comes from chapter 8 here down the bottom, nerves and nodal points, communications, and the formation of imperial networking. Right, I would like to begin this lecture, this oration, with reference to the here and now. The principal title of the talk, Back to the Future, is of course an allusion to the echoes of history, which are all around us, but which oftentimes fail to resonate in our minds because of the way events and their impact, so to speak, fade through time. Although those echoes are there, we can and often fail to perceive them. I say this because the underlying subject matter of this talk concerns communications technology and its relationship to architecture, which I'll come back to. This is a subject matter, the political implications of which are as alive today as they were over 150 years ago, when the Telegraph first began to display its awesome power and capacity to affect social organisation, and all that entails across the face of the earth. In many ways, and at base perhaps, it's a story of those eternal human themes of power, economic expansion, and empire, then as now. The rise of this technology in its concentration in the hands of Western powers and the advent of what the historian Eric Hobsbawm once called the Great Age of Empire was, of course, hardly a coincidence. The geopolitical tensions that arose in the wake of the full implementation of this technology, exacerbating the rivalry between the great powers at the turn of the 20th century, that is the United Kingdom, Germany, Russia, the United States, and later Japan, are not so different from the geopolitical effects that we are now experiencing in the 21st century over anxieties concerning who develops, controls, and ultimately manipulates 5G digital communications technology. There is a new great power rivalry brewing in the midst of this struggle. Indeed, some would say has broken fully onto the surface with Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. Only the players strutting across the world stage now are slightly different. The UK, the US, and of course Russia are still there, but have now been joined by China. Germany has become part of a bigger political and economic bloc represented by the European Union. This rivalry is being staged as a contest between the free democratic alliance of the United States, Europe and their partners, including NATO, and of course Australia and New Zealand are part of that, and the authoritarian axis of Russia, China, and to a lesser extent, Iran. First power rivalry of this kind ended, as we know, in the First World War. How it will end this time, nobody knows. But with nuclear weapons abundant, the stakes could hardly be higher. Indeed, nuclear saber rattling has already begun, sadly. These synergies between these epochs of step change in telecommunications development are also resonant, I think. Just to take us back a few years, by the 1880s, Britain had a sizable command over world communications, with its control of around 50% or more of global telegraph cabling through corporations such as the Eastern Telegraph Company. Not content, Britain would go on to create its own all-red line, spanning the globe, passing only through British-controlled territory and protected waters, in order to obtain a totally secure closed circuit. As tension between the great powers escalated, anxiety over communication security likewise increased, reaching fever pitch by the end of the century. Again, it's possible to see clear parallels here between national security interests and the installation of fifth-generation telecommunications infrastructure in our own time. To be clear, the similarity consists not only in who owns, installs, and operates such technology, but, and most importantly, I think, who actually controls it. However, now it's China in the driving seat, with the upper hand in terms of technology transfer, leaving Western democracies to ponder how to plug the apparent security deficit. Moreover, we hear of Russian submarines patrolling the North Sea now in an effort, among other things, to identify and map undersea telecommunications infrastructure in order to sabotage it in the event of conflict, just as Royal Navy ships did with respect to German cables in the lead up to World War I. Indeed, we know that, given its commanding position with respect to telegraph infrastructure, Britain did in fact eavesdrop on the commercial and diplomatic communications of its rivals. And so, as the title of this news report on the right suggests, who wouldn't do it if they had the chance? That's the reality, that's the realpolitik, as it were, that we now face. How any of this, if at all, feeds into current architectural discourse is yet to be determined. And it, of course, is a question for future generations of architectural historians to consider. But what is clear is that such concerns did have an appreciable impact on architecture in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods. Indeed, it may be more accurate to say that architecture enjoyed something of a sort of co-productive relationship with such concerns. Or to put this another way, some of British architecture's theoretical ambitions, architectural theoretical ambitions, were coterminous with concerns of this nature. So let's consider this in a bit more detail. Again, starting with a wide lens, as I say, this has much to do with imperialism. More specifically, with the widely held perception that British global power was on the wane during the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, and what to do about that. Now, for those who identified themselves with the new imperialist movement of that period, building and consolidating a sense of greater British identity and cooperation was increasingly seen as one of the remedies. This was understood in terms of overcoming the difficulties of distance, that famous tyranny, as Geoffrey Blainey memorably described it. The physical reality of space had been the great stumbling block, of course, of the Imperial Federation movement, for example, and improved modes of communication, that is, rail, steamer, and telegraphy, were perceived as key to its conquest of distance, that is. The hope was that new transport and communications technologies would, to use a well-worn phrase, annihilate space, thus facilitating a novel kind of modernized imperial community. Many such visions, initially at least, had a distinct futurist air about them and were often either naively optimistic or entirely fanciful. The technology may have existed, inspiring theories of quicker and more reliable forms of connectivity, but questions of a practical nature remained. One such was security. As the tentacles of Britain's global transport and communications systems grew and thickened year on year, how to defend the goods and information they conveyed became a matter of urgency. Many began to see these extended lines as a fundamental weakness, vulnerable to enemy sabotage, destruction, or eavesdropping, not merely undermining, but potentially destroying British trade and diplomacy, and by extension, the British Empire itself. These fears only became more acute as Britain entered the age of great power rivalry towards the close of the 19th century. In this context, efficient lines of communication were seen as literally the lifeblood of the British imperial system, with their constriction or severance leading to catastrophic, even fatal outcomes. These lines were, of course, vulnerable precisely because they were physical. They occupied space as forms of material infrastructure, exposed and therefore susceptible to interference from malevolent actors, including belligerent enemy states. Moreover, they could just as easily succumb to human error or inherent defects. Early experiments in the laying of long-distance submarine cables, for example, had exposed such failings. Therefore, in the case of telegraphy, there may have been a sort of revolutionary dematerialization of communication, that is, fewer and fewer letters over time, comparatively speaking, but the media through which such communication occurred was still entirely physical. The nature of infrastructure as such varied considerably, from cables and tracks to signals instrumentation and buildings. Indeed, as recent scholarship has argued, infrastructure in this regard had particular architectonic dimensions and vice versa. Buildings of many different kinds, particularly from the advent of electrical telegraphy onward, were literally linked one to another via communications infrastructure and were increasingly perceived as such. Unlike the infrastructures associated with, say, plumbing, that is gas, water, and sewage, telegraphy made the functional dispersion of space and power over it possible, if not more likely, in the age of the telephone, or as the age of the telephone loomed. Buildings themselves became hubs or nodes in a wider infrastructural circuitry, just as infrastructure connected or restructured the spatial configuration of buildings into larger clusters of networked architectures. In this new age of near instant and continuous global communication, where ideas of a smaller or compressed world prevailed, peoples and communities separated by distance felt closer than ever before. Now, despite the agitations of nascent nationalist movements, particularly in the 1880s and 90s, this had a powerful psychological and emotional effect in terms of galvanizing underlying sentiments towards Britishness and British identity that might otherwise have broken entirely, encouraging new kinds of socially constituted spatiality, which in turn provoked discussion of a common architectural language that might express it. This debate was heard in relation to train stations and post offices, as well as in other buildings and structures associated with industries of communication at the time, such as the headquarters of telegraph, rail, and shipping companies. Now, I should say that much of the faith invested in the promise of modern communications technology during the late 19th and early 20th centuries derived its power from suggestive comparison, analogy, and metaphor. In time, this would amount to a rhetorical discourse concerning the figural synergy and mutual moral integrity between natural and man-made technological systems. Now, I don't really want to delve into this too much here tonight because I don't really have time, but almost from its advent, telegraphy attracted persistent, if somewhat misplaced, comparisons with nerves and neural networks from within the animal kingdom and living organisms more generally. This, it may be suggested, led to a form of co-productive conceptualization, spawning in the process a whole tradition of what Graham Thompson has termed, quote unquote, organicist electric utopianism. Phenomenal consonants of this kind soon acquired social and political force and meaning beyond its merely scientific utility. This included the projection of psychological and behavioral traits associated with the study of the nervous system in humans especially the brain, which was considered the governing seat or command center of bodily order and control. From here, politicians, bureaucrats, and businessmen could easily perceive the implications that apparently instant electrified communication had for social and commercial discipline, including the imposition of new regimes of time. Likewise, ideas of circulation and circulatory systems, which had their own natural parallels, were applied to trade and wider transportation routes, including rail trunks and branches, postal veins, and other webs of vital supply. These were normally translated in terms of the health and efficiency of any given economic or political body. Generally speaking, the better the transmission and circulation of goods, people, and information, the healthier the body politic, and therefore its potential for growth. Organic function, including coherence and dynamism, was also a lesson derived from the study of natural systems, which in turn informed social Darwinist conceptions of the world. As the Canadian inventor and railway engineer Stanford Fleming remarked, and I quote here, "A complete telegraph system will be as indispensable to the commerce of the new empire which is being developed as the nervous system is to the human body." Such language, of course, served to shape as well as direct attitudes towards Britain and its imperial enterprise, helping forge a mentality of benign organic validation. That is to say, that ideas of growth and of evolution through contest were considered both natural and good. Now, as far as architecture relates to these ideas of networks and circulation, I could discuss railway, post office, or indeed shipping company buildings, especially in the way that these began to engage with ideas of identity through extended connectivity, that is, this idea of greater Britishness into the Edwardian period. And there are many I could point to, such as ones you see here on the screen. Here on the left, we have the Eastern Railway Company headquarters building in York, in England. Across on the far right, we have Herbert Baker in Pretoria, South Africa, with the train station there. And of course, at the bottom here, Flinders Street Station in Melbourne. Also, post offices are good for this. Here at the bottom left, we have the GPO in London by Henry Tanner, the GPO in Wellington by John Campbell here in the centre top. And on the far right, we have the GPO in Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. All these buildings are from the first decade of the 20th century. And even on a smaller scale, we can see this kind of thing coming through. So here on the left, we have the Ipswich Telegraph and Post Office building in Queensland by Thomas Pye. And down at the bottom middle there, we have the GPO in Johannesburg in South Africa. Also shipping companies were in on the game here. We've got here on the left, the headquarters of Lloyd's Register of Shipping in London. And there on the right, the Mersey Docks and Harbour building in Liverpool. Again, both in the first decade of the 20th century. However, as important as ship and rail transportation were, it was telegraphy that remained at the forefront of the geopolitical imagination. The one organisation that virtually controlled the burgeoning telegraph industry during the latter 19th and early 20th centuries was, as I say, the Eastern Telegraph Company based in London. Formed in 1872 from the amalgamation of 4 smaller British-based companies, by 1902, it had grown into a massive consortium of subsidiaries known as the Eastern and Associated Telegraph Companies, or the Eastern Group for short. So large and dominant had it become by this time that, again, as I say, it owned and operated nearly or more than 50% of the world's submarine cable network, amounting to some 100,000 nautical miles. This dominance was in effect a UK, indeed British world monopoly. This dominance benefited the British business world tremendously, of course, with London being the company's principal exchange hub. This cemented the city's influence as the epicenter of imperial and much global communications intelligence. Such a large corporation, and one so important to the British economy, necessarily required a large and impressive head office. Previously located at Winchester House, Old Broad Street in London, the group, as it were, approached the English architect John Belcher in 1899 to design a wholly new purpose-built facility to accommodate its expansion. Situated on Moorgate, just north of London Wall, this building became known as Electra House and was completed in 1902. Ironically, despite all the benefits brought by telegraphy and the telephone, proximity and maintaining a certain physical presence, it seems, still mattered to these kind of corporations. In this context, the company was determined to be conspicuous. It was, after all, one of the United Kingdom's premier corporations, with assets and share capital alone totaling some £12 million, which in today's money would be some several billion. Therefore, it made a knowing decision when engaging John Belcher as architect here. By this time, Belcher had already developed quite a high profile as a practitioner. His Institute of Chartered Accountants building, which was virtually on the other side of the road at 1 Moorgate, was a highly acclaimed piece of architecture at the time. He had completed also his designs for Colchester Town Hall a few years previous and was soon to become president of the RIBA, not to mention his gold medalist in 1907. Designing a building of this nature was particularly suited to Belcher's talents. Indeed, he seems to have relished the opportunity, later ranking the building so highly among his numerous architectural works that it was the only one he chose to depict in his RIBA portrait of 1907. So here you can see in the portrait a model of the dome, and he's holding the original drawings in his hand there. The first thing that strikes one about the design for Electra House is how typical it is of Belcher's mature style, being one of Britain's leading exponents of the grand manner, or so-called Edwardian Baroque revival style of architecture. Having co-authored with Mervyn Macartney the influential later Renaissance architecture in England, it's hardly surprising that he would produce a design for Electra House brimming with a certain Baroque vigour. Much like the Institute of Chartered Accountants building, the surface here ripples with bold, projecting detail. This was calculated to embody a certain attitude, it may be suggested, one that was concerned with celebrating the Eastern Group's market position and heroic status as the pivot of British imperial communications. The sense of corporate identity and purpose was evidently strong here. Therefore, at one level, the architectural effect of Belcher's design is an immediate and unmistakable impression of strength. At the time, the building was described, in fact, as massive and dignified, with an architecture that was, quote, broad, imposing, and masculine in treatment, end quote. Now, there is a whole backstory, it has to be said, concerning the gendered claims of the Edwardian Baroque, this idea of masculinity and so on, which I won't go into detail here. Suffice it to say that it was both real and pressing at this time. Indeed, the themes of power and strength identified in relation to this particular building's architecture had their corollary in the manly effort that was perceived as requisite to the making, laying, and maintenance of the group's worldwide network of lines and cables. Throughout the heyday of submarine telegraphy, much play was made of the physical struggle involved in the countless images produced of the enterprise as it unfolded, often in the face of persistent failure. Whether of cable ships battling against the high seas, or of large half-submerged groups of sweaty men hauling cables ashore, these images sought to capture the risk, the bravery, and even the sacrifice necessary to complete this all-important task. In this, telegraphy was comparable to other great communications endeavours, such as transcontinental railway construction, which was frequently presented as a kind of feat of national and imperial heroism, such as the Canadian Pacific Railway. Such exploits were examples of technological imperialism in action, couched primarily as a struggle against nature and the environment. Equally significant here were the masculine attributes associated with electrical energy itself in the late Victorian and Edwardian, or during the late Victorian and Edwardian period. Again, grounded in metaphor and analogy, nervous energy or force was understood in economic terms with respect to economy of resource. Therefore, a kind of weak or sensitive nervous system was equated with effeminacy, and therefore with diminished capability and or mismanagement. But of course, on the other hand, the upright and reliable English gentleman was strong of nervous disposition, with power over bodily economy, including order and clarity of mind. Electricity and therefore electrical and telegraphic impulses were therefore considered and understood in the context of masculine virility and vitality of potent energy. Therefore, the impression given was one of telegraphy as a kind of man's business, requiring manly conduct and responsibility across its extended network to function as anticipated. This, despite the increasing number of female copyists who were being employed by the industry from about the 1870s onwards, in the face of some criticism, has to be said. At another level, such a large and conspicuous building was a tremendous opportunity for corporate publicity. The Eastern Group was clearly determined through the medium of architecture to project an image of itself and its operations to the outside world. This was picked up in the architectural press, which was at pains to highlight the building's elaborate decorative program. For example, in reproducing Belcher's original facade to Moorgate, the Builder magazine noted that, and I quote, "In this design, the idea has been to symbolize as much as possible the work and scope of the important companies that are to occupy the building. Hence, the frequent introduction of spheres and globes and other geographical and electrical insignia," end quote. Indeed, looking closely at some of the drawings of Belcher's original design, we get a good idea of the sculptural program that he had intended for the building's facade. For example, running across the fourth-story cornice here were 16 winged putti perched on globes, clasping heraldic devices. Here's a close-up. So here we can see, or can be seen, that these globes are inscribed with lines, like so many hanging threads, indicating the submarine cables operated by the Eastern Group, while the devices wielded by the putti represent caducei and tridents. Now, seen together and in sequence, these sculptures reveal the global extent of the company's network. The practical and political symbolism of this fact is enhanced by the nature of the devices that the putti carry. The caduceus, or herald's wand, staff, signifying communication. The trident, of course, British command over the seas. As mentioned, the submarine cables of British telegraph companies relied on Royal Naval protection for their guarantee against enemy sabotage. In this sense, the sea was understood as Britain's domain, its command a strategic necessity. Looking at the base of the building's dome, we notice the prows of numerous ships jutting forth, as though the structure were crowned by a giant rostral column indicative of the state-sponsored service that lay behind the company's success. Here too can be seen other motifs emblematic of oceanic dominion, such as the delphinic-style fish descending from the top of the cupola. Bordering on the arrogant, you might say, such classical allusion may be considered evocative of ancient Roman and by extension, by extension, British Imperium. Corporation and kingdom worked hand in glove to secure Britain's strategic interests. Then, as now, governments and leading telecommunications companies were wholly interdependent. These globe-trotting putti, however, were never realized. They were replaced in the end, in the final design, by a series of electrified torch lamps in the shape of globes. But other aspects of the sculptural program were, in fact, carried out. In the spandrels immediately above the main entrance arch to the building, for instance, are two large figures in relief. These were executed by the sculptor George Frampton, and according to the Builder magazine, represented, quote unquote, electricity in connection with telegraphy, with the figure on the left transmitting a message to that on the right. Now, this allegory, has to be said, is somewhat obscure. What is clear, I think, is that both panels obviously have or depict seated women with angelic assistants. The one supposedly composing a message here on the left, you can see with the pen in her hand, the other apparently receiving it on the right. Now, behind the figures, you can see up there wires and insulators associated with overland telegraphy, invoking the idea of electrified communication. Now, beneath, as inside the entrance porch directly below this, are two further relief panels, left and right. These were by the sculptor F.W. Pomeroy. Both depict ancient warrior women, as you can see, allegorical of navigation and engineering in this case. Evident here are representations of submarine cables spanning the globe. So you can see here on this image on the left, a globe with these cables wrapped around it, along with other types of telegraphic equipment, such as relay apparatus. So the figure on this left panel to the back there on the right is holding a relay apparatus for a telegraph machine, basically. Mythical figures here are also represented. I've got the cursor here. So this is the figure I was talking about, the apparatus here, the relay apparatus. And here we have other ancient allegorical figures. In this case, Mercury, god of communication and commerce. Together, these panels, like those above, concern the heroic nature of telegraphy, lending it a degree of normalized cultural legitimacy by way of classical allusion. The centerpiece of the building's decorative schema, however, is the extraordinary stained glass lunette by Powell and Company to a design by Belcher spanning the main entranceway. Just to go back, I'm talking about this massive window right here. Here's the original design for it. Depicted here is a female figure seated on a globe, as you can see, in a quasi-defiant posture, generating what appears to be lightning bolts from a halo above her head. It might be supposed that this figure, given the name of the building, represents Electra, goddess of storm clouds. But she also has attributes of other ancient goddesses, such as Astrape, goddess of lightning. In any case, as noted in the corporate literature on the building, she is, quote unquote, an allegorical figure, and was therefore, I think, much like the architecture itself, most likely a kind of invented amalgam from more than one ancient mythical source. Streaming from the halo here, going out like this, you can see, beams of light indicative of electrical energy. Beneath, a galleon bobs on a choppy sea, directed by the guiding rays of a lighthouse. The overarching message seems to be, at least what I think it is supposed to mean, is that commerce and communication, once slow and assisted by more primitive, less reliable sources of light, are now energized by a new lightning fast electrical form of light, which has effectively tamed the forces of nature. There's this idea of the abolition of time and space that I referred to earlier, making for an infinitely quicker and more secure system of information transmission. The contrast is striking. This idea is reinforced by the presence of a caduceus clasped by the figure here, you can see, yeah. And the globe upon which she sits, strewn with the lines of submarine telegraph cables, like the arteries on the surface of a heart. Elsewhere are figures representing the various nations of the East, India, China, Japan, and Egypt, as well as relief panels by the sculptor Alfred Drury containing the arms of the numerous companies that comprise the Eastern Group. The scheme was carried inside the building around the main entrance vestibule, which was to be decorated extensively with relief panels depicting the work of the company in different locations around the world. Another of the features that was completed as originally planned was the prominent bronze Amillery sphere crowning the building's dome, with a globe suspended in the middle itself, a symbol of discovery and empire, and held aloft by a group of 4 youthful atlases. This was designed and executed by Pomeroy, and as you can see, or may just be able to see, it is emblazoned with symbols of the zodiac across here. In several places across the upper levels of the facade, flanking the broken pediments and around the drum of the dome, lion head plaques make an appearance. And of course, lions, lion head, are well-known symbols and well-understood symbols of Britannic imperium and of Britannic associations. Here, architecture and sculpture worked seamlessly together in a classically Baroque manner. In this sense, if the Eastern Group's network of submarine cables may be likened to a web in which the political tensions of great power rivalry were entangled, then the regulated mesh of Electra House's architecture similarly, and in a figurative sense, ensnared global geography, submitting it to the whims of commercial and, by extension, imperial prerogative. This must be appreciated, I would argue, in order to grasp fully the semiotic intent of the building as a medium through which the Eastern Group both publicised and legitimated its activities, including its cosy relationship with official power structures. At the dawn of an age where printed advertising was or had almost reached saturation point, architecture of this kind had a function that was more than merely practical. Now, the geopolitical semantics, as it were, of Electra House were in a sense echoes of the rise of applied or so-called new geography in the late 19th century. Led by influential strategists and academics such as A.T. Mann and Alfred Mackinder, this phenomenon would come to affect international relations and military policy planning to a considerable degree in the 20th century. Mackinder, so-called father of new geography, emerged as a particularly important figure in this world of geopolitical theorizing. A leading liberal imperialist, Mackinder was keen to promote an understanding of Britain's rise to imperial preeminence as an outcome of unique geographical factors, including physical, economic, and social circumstances and constraints. In this sense, and in accordance with a broadly social Darwinian outlook, he perceived geography as not merely the study of time and space in the abstract, but more specifically as a process of the unfolding of cultural time according to the contingencies thrown up by physical environment. Thus, for Mackinder, like Peter Halen before him, history and geography were like two blades of a pair of scissors. Good, effective, and efficient statesmanship, it was claimed, relied on such an outlook. Indeed, it was a strategic requirement, believed Mackinder and others, bringing advantage to any society that could grasp its analytical power. Now, as scholars have highlighted, this geopolitical worldview encouraged by Mackinder may have positioned the irrefutable realities of the physical world at its apex, but it ultimately rested on the ability of communities to overcome the obstacles of physical space via communication routes and their concomitant technologies, what Mackinder called equipment or capital appliances. As Mackinder himself observed, with the age of discovery practically over by the turn of the 20th century, his so-called post-Columbian age, only those nations able to command the regions and resources of the world fully known would triumph. This was basically the core of his message in his lectures before the Institute of Bankers in 1899, that history was essentially the story of those who held, protected, and exploited key trading routes. This was the basis of his so-called geographical pivot, which would determine the future of world affairs. It's worth mentioning in passing that Kinder has suddenly come back into vogue, being studied closely by nations like China and Russia. Consequently, in modern times, and it's going back to the early 20th century, there arose the quote-unquote complete political appropriation of world space, instituting a kind of closed system of competitive international relations, which was one of the hallmarks of the new imperialism. This idea was perhaps best articulated in his statement that as far as this new post-discovery world organism was concerned, quote, "We now have a closed circuit, a machine complete and balanced in all its parts. Touch one and you influence all," end quote. The advent of this geographical reality meant that national and by extension imperial success rested upon a race for relative efficiency between nations, quote, "for empire in the world," end quote. The world circuit, again, a nervous electrical analogy, had been fully integrated by steam-powered locomotion and telecommunications systems. The circulation and control of goods, of resources, and capital along and within the reach and speed of these networks is what tipped the competitive balance of power one way or the other. For Mackinder, global closure heralded a conflict between empires that Britain simply had to win. Considering this new geopolitical reality and its strategic ways of thinking, it was the realization of the all-red line that I mentioned earlier that provided Britain with one aspect of its preparedness in this regard, with the Eastern group like a great rapacious octopus residing in its core. Indeed, according to Mackinder's geographical schema, Electra House itself may be considered a key example of a capital apparatus within this world circuit, akin to something like a brain, you might say. Looking at the building's plan, we can see that to what extent it was, in fact, a command center of sorts. The allocation of space demonstrates the true nature of the group's corporate structure, revealing the magnitude of its subsidiary operations. The spatial layout of the building is a form of organizational diagram, a geography and microcosm, as it were, indicative of the way the company functioned. Now, it's worth pointing out here that in the top left of this image, of this plan, we have the offices of the Eastern Extension Telegraph Company, which many of you thought probably was an Australian company. It was for a while, covering the Australasian region, including Southeast Asia. But by this point, it too had become part of this much bigger Eastern group corporation. This gives you, again, an impression of the extent and scale of this corporation. A bit like today's Googles and Amazons and that kind of thing. Some spaces were leased to other companies, but the bulk of the building was in fact occupied by the group itself across levels 3 to 6 and in the basement, with the principal office spaces arrayed along the front and flanking perimeters of the second and third floors. These spaces were marked out externally by the giant order Corinthian columns spanning these floors, which you can see right through the middle of it here. The technical specifications for the building were also very high. The group's corporate literature placed specific emphasis on the modernity of its new premises, dedicating 4 of the 7 pages of its text to its description. This is akin to what Kim Dovey in another context referred to as a building's imputed intelligence, being a more or less explicit tactic in promotional literature regarding a work of architecture's technological superiority. It was about selling the future in many ways and investing the corporation via its premises with an aura of special access. Here, subjects such as electric lighting, telephones, laboratories, heating and ventilation, lifts, and pneumatic tubing were explained. For instance, among the numerous illustrations in the company's pamphlet, there is a photograph of the managing director's office with a 10-way telephone bell indicator console situated prominently on the desk, which you can see is down here. This piece of modern kit not only suggested the director's placement and control at the very heart of the company's operations, but was also indicative of the complexity of the building's intercommunication system, which comprised some 15 miles of wiring. Detailed section diagrams showed how the building had numerous purpose-built bulkhead and cavity spaces for the huge amount of wiring and ventilation ducts required. But there were three spaces in particular, I think, of interest in this building. The first of these, high up on the 6th floor, in the drum of the dome, was the so-called electrical laboratory. Here, according to the company's pamphlet, was, quote, all the necessary apparatus to enable the electrical staff to investigate any new problem and to test apparatus with the view of improving the working of the company's cables, end quote. Now, as Richard Noakes has shown, contrary to previous assumptions, scientific research at the Eastern Group was taken seriously. Led by its chief electrical engineer, you can see him here, Henry Saunders, the work carried out in the Electro House laboratory by the newly formed investigation branch became an important element of the group's strategy for competitive advantage, including the development of its own wireless technology. The second space of interest is the telegram receiving room on the building's ground floor. In here was located a pneumatic tube system connected directly via an underground conduit to the group's principal receiving station 300 meters away on Old Broad Street. So it's something that looks a bit like this. This is not the exact one, but it would have looked very similar to this. This is contemporary with it. Powered by an electrical driven air compressor, the time taken to send messages between the two locations was 52 seconds exactly. The third space was the company's or the group's probation transcribers training school located in the bowels of the building. Again, as Ewan Morris has argued, such spaces were central to the maintenance of professional discipline and control within telegraph companies, where the exacting standards demanded by competition were inculcated, surveyed, and instituted. In conjunction with overall corporate governance, this training regime and its clerical graduates produced what Patrick Joyce has termed a quote unquote carefully shaped tool for efficient managerial purposes. So just to wrap things up here, what I'd say by way of conclusion is simply to reiterate an observation I made at the beginning of this talk, and that concerns what I called the co-productive relationship between architecture and anxieties over British imperial decline at this point in time, or how British architecture's theoretical ambitions seem to be coterminous with concerns of this nature. Clearly, architecture was seen as having a role explicitly, not just for its symbolic capacity, but in its embodiment of new modes of functionality, in pushing back against and mitigating this fear of falling, as John Darwin has called it. This applied as much to government architecture animated by new agendas of efficiency as it did to corporate architecture. In this respect, the apparent social function of architecture mattered. As one of the great proponents of the grand manner or Edwardian Baroque movement in British architecture, Reginald Blomfield, put it, and I quote, "Architecture itself is something very much greater than a design process of details and construction. It is something beyond and outside all of this," end quote. And I think the Edwardians were very much alive to this idea of, and what the built environment might do as a socially responsive art form in that respect. And so tonight, I hope I have given you a glimpse, even if only a glimpse, of this process in action, and how in this particular example, we are reminded of the, dare I say it, cyclical nature of history, and how even the history of the built environment might provide a lens through which to understand and put into perspective some of our own preoccupations and anxieties. Thank you.
We have an opportunity for some questions to be asked. I'd like to ask Alex a question.
Alex, have you given any attention to the architecture of the telegraph stations, repeater stations, and so on themselves?
A little bit. So some of these buildings, like some of the small. So when I in the actual book, when I expand on this subject, I look at it not just in London, but of course across the British world. At that point, I look a bit more at some of these smaller buildings in some of the more remote parts of the British Empire, and how these were all sort of connected one to another via these networks. But I don't go into a lot of detail about, of course I talk about the architects and some of the things they were thinking and so on, but I don't really go into a lot of detail about how they were actually built or put together. But I think if I was to do a kind of separate study of this phenomenon alone and expand on it a bit more, I think I would be interested to look at not only how these buildings were put together physically, but also their own kind of networks of material assemblage, which I think are also part of this bigger picture of how things moved around the British world and across various parts of the British world at this point in time.
I just comment on that. Frederick Braby of Glasgow and London advertised as a specialist in buildings for telegraph stations. Seems to me quite significant.
Yeah, I've come across something like this. I'm not sure it was him, but there was certainly companies which, as you might expect, began to specialize in this kind of thing, whether it be, of course, with apparatus technology or the infrastructure itself, including aspects of buildings or entire buildings. Of course, when these cables came ashore in various parts, these various stop-off points here, they normally had to have some kind of station or some physical structure to go into before they were then redistributed across various land masses. So those kind of buildings, which were often rather nondescript and not really made a spectacle of, because they're often places that no one ever went to. But I think they are important to the overall picture in some way, this structure, this much bigger structure which coalesces through all of this kind of technology.
Lex, did Eastern do similar buildings elsewhere in the world, in the empire? Did they go off and build headquarters buildings in Australia or wherever of the same sort of scale with the same intent?
Yeah, so interesting you should mention that. So, in fact, as you can see from that map I showed you, the plan, the so-called Eastern Telegraph Company was actually a subsidiary. It was a company that was made up of all these other subsidiaries, but was in fact one function really of one corporation. And some of these other subsidiary companies, like the Eastern Extension Telegraph Company, they built numerous buildings of this kind, not as big as this, but some of them are quite large. I'm thinking of the one in Hong Kong, which is quite a large, substantial granite structure in the sort of Edwardian block style. And there were numerous others, which also were part of this broader movement architecturally, but on a slightly smaller scale, depending on where they were. And some of them, as I showed you, some of them, like the one in Ipswich by Thomas Pye, is a relatively small building by these standards, but still wish to, in some sense, express itself quite boldly through its architecture, through its rendition of the rock sort.
Yes. Thank you very much. You're very informed and great talk, Alex. I'm just wondering, are they still extant, many of these buildings?
I haven't really, well, the one in Queensland I showed you is. The one in Johannesburg, I don't think so. The one in Vancouver is. So a lot of them, I'm sorry, the post offices and so on, they are still exist. They sometimes have been transformed into something else. So the one in Vancouver is now a shopping centre. As tends to happen to these kind of buildings once they're with their previous useful. But I think in a lot of places where cities expand and grow rapidly, some of these buildings fall by the wayside and demolished. But some still do exist.
Moorgate still stands, doesn't it?
Yeah, so this one, the one you mentioned, what the Electra House? Yes, yep, that's still there, but it's now changed hands many times. The last iteration was a university building, but even that university was pulled out of it. So it's now sitting vacant, but no doubt will be occupied very soon. It's a prime piece of real estate in the heart of the city.
Now, Alex, I had a question. If we're looking at the British network of telegraphy across the globe, are there others? Because should we also be seeing other maps, the German network? Is it only the British? I mean, I imagine the Spaniards, are there other nationally driven telegraphy systems?
Yeah, so if you haven't got a map here, but if you look at a map, say, especially at the Atlantic Ocean, what you're going to see is this thick, massive lines. By the time you get to the 19th century, it's out of the 20s. A lot of companies have more than one, but the Eastern Telegraph had at least 3 more cables, duplicate cables between London and New York in case one or two fell out. Keep communications going. So various other European companies, the French in particular, had their own networks going across the Atlantic. But in the wider British world, that's where Britain really, and this company really had a certain kind of scalar power to implement this. So going across the Pacific, their cable was the only one for a long time that took a lot of government funding. So the company itself could not really fund that cable. So it took government subvention funding under the banner of security to get that cable in line to make sure it across the ocean.
Yes, just in relation to that, I think actually Australia's first action in the First World War was sending the HMAS Sydney up to New Guinea to knock out the German telegraph station there. So I'm just wondering too, where you look at the architecture in terms of the British Empire, there was a similar sort of architecture response in the other empires too.
Yeah, so it's true. So any nation that had aspired to its own independent telegraph network would have to have the same kind of infrastructure, both cabling and stations and all the rest of it. And as you say, and as I also mentioned in the lecture, this was one of the things the Royal Navy was tasked with doing in the lead up to the First World War, was to identify and knock out these cables.
Barry.
Given the kind of neo-imperialism in the United States, around the time of McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, there must have been strong telegraph links, and bearing in mind that the whole idea of the Monroe Doctrine, presumably very strong telegraph links between South America, Mexico, and the United States, perhaps including Canada. I don't know. Is that correct?
I don't know for sure. I don't know how those, whether some of that was overland telegraphy or a lot of it was underwater, a submarine.
A long way.
Yeah, it was a long way. But I have come across evidence of, for instance, certain, how shall we call them, media outlets like Reuters and so on, and AP, they were at this time trying to get control of traffic, monopolized traffic on these cables. And I came across a reference from a Frenchman based somewhere in South America trying to represent French interests, and he found it impossible to get any information other than English and the English language on on the main cables running through South America, across the Atlantic, even up to North America. He said basically it was all English, British and American news, and it made him feel like he was a sort of honorary Englishman. And he felt that had a certain kind of cultural effect. It's like he said that over time, what this will mean is the erosion of other European languages and cultures. I think that was kind of somewhat prescient, because, you know, these days, with, well, certainly for a long time, with US's control of film and television and so on, the English language was perpetuated even further and more strongly across the globe in the 20th century. So yeah, I don't know for sure exactly where the cables went up, and if they went up and down the coast too, or whether it was on land or submarine, probably a bit of both, but I'm sure that was there.
Well, Alex, thank you. I'd like to close proceedings by thanking Theo Blanket, who has been in the background managing all of this technologically. I'd like to thank the Vera Moore Foundation and also Miles Lewis for their support of the Miles Lewis Fellowship. But most of all, Alex Bremner, we'd like to thank you very much for the presentation.